In medieval Scandinavia, winter was not just a season people waited out. It controlled life in a deep and constant way. Snow covered the land for most of the year, sometimes so completely that familiar paths disappeared. Light slowly faded until days felt like endless twilight, and then even that was gone. Cold shaped everything. It decided how people worked, what they ate, how they thought, and whether they survived at all. Winter was not something that came and went. It was always present in the background, pressing in every single day. Scandinavia sat far to the north compared to most of Europe, while places like France or Italy received strong sunlight. The sun in Scandinavia stayed low in the sky, even in summer. Its warmth was weak and brief. Heat escaped quickly, and the land never had enough time to truly warm up before winter returned. Latitude was not just a map detail. It controlled how life worked. Summers were short and uncertain. There was barely enough time to grow barley or collect hay, and even then, success was never guaranteed. A late snow melt, too much rain, or an early frost could wipe out months of work. People lived knowing that nature allowed almost no mistakes. The land itself offered little escape. Mountains, dense forests, and long coastlines kept communities isolated. Unlike southern regions that could rely on trade routes, steady migration, or varied climates, Scandinavia remained trapped in its northern reality. Warm winds weakened before reaching it. Cold Arctic air arrived easily and stayed. In the Middle Ages, climate was not a theory or a topic of debate. It was a hard boundary that could not be crossed. Cold was not a temporary hardship. It was the environment itself, shaping culture, economy, and survival. Winter did not arrive gently, and it did not leave quickly. Cold seasons often lasted 6 to 8 months, swallowing spring and cutting autumn short. Snow fell early, turned into ice, and stayed long after fields in southern Europe had turned green again. Farming suffered under this rhythm. Fields stayed frozen while animals needed constant feeding. Stored fodder slowly disappeared. Planting could only begin once the soil softened, and even then frost could return without warning. One freezing night could destroy young crops and erase months of hope. The mental weight of this long winter was heavy. Darkness lingered. Movement slowed. Villages turned inward, saving energy, food, and effort. In places where winter was only a pause, life could resume quickly. In Scandinavia, winter was the main condition of existence. Early frost forced rushed harvests that were often incomplete. People depended on preserved food and small yields. When failure came, it did not arrive suddenly. It appeared quietly as hunger that stretched across months. Winter was not a break from life. It was the setting in which life happened. Everything else felt temporary. From the late Middle Ages, conditions grew even worse. A long period of cooling, now called the Little Ice Age, lowered temperatures across Europe for generations. Scandinavia felt its effects more strongly than most. Winters became longer, darker, and less predictable. Rivers froze earlier and stayed frozen, disrupting fishing, transport, and mills. Glaciers advanced in mountain areas, slowly taking over pasture land. Coastal waters became unreliable as sea ice blocked travel and reduced access to fish. Crop failures increased. Barley and rye, already difficult to grow, failed more often as summers stayed cold and frosts arrived late or early. Hay harvests shrank, leading to starving animals. When livestock died, families lost food, materials, and labor all at once. Hunger stopped being an occasional disaster and became a repeated cycle. The damage did not come from one terrible year, but from many bad years in a row. Cold followed cold. Failure followed failure. Recovery became impossible. Scarcity became expected. Darkness made the cold even harder to endure. As winter deepened, daylight shrank dramatically. In the far north, the sun barely rose. In some places, it disappeared completely for weeks. Without light, many tasks became difficult or impossible. Repairs, preparation, and hunting slowed. Work happened by firelight, which was dim, smoky, and expensive in fuel. At the same time, survival demands increased. The human body suffered in quiet ways. Limited sunlight reduced energy and weakened resistance to illness. Fatigue became constant. Sleep patterns broke down. Morale declined. Winter sickness came not only from hunger and cold, but from exhaustion made worse by darkness. Psychologically, long nights changed behavior. People gathered indoors, conserving warmth and strength. Social life narrowed. Silence and endurance became necessary traits. Cold limited movement. Darkness drained will. Together, they formed a cycle that defined life year after year. The land itself offered little help. Much of Scandinavia rested on thin, rocky soil shaped by glaciers. And like fertile plains elsewhere in Europe, these fields gave little back. Farming was possible, but only barely. Grain yields were low and unpredictable. Rain or cold could destroy them easily. Most communities relied on barley, oats, and rye, chosen not for abundance, but for survival. Even these crops struggled to mature in the short growing season. There was no safety net. When harvest failed, famine followed quickly. Animals helped, but they depended on fragile systems too. Livestock needed hay through long winters. Poor summer growth meant not enough fodder. When animals starved, families lost meat, milk, hides, and labor power at the same time. One bad year could erase years of slow progress. Farming was not about growth or surplus. It was about avoiding disaster. Fields were small, carefully managed, and always at risk. Every choice mattered because there was no second chance once winter arrived. Cold in Scandinavia was rarely dry. Winds from the North Atlantic carried moisture that turned low temperatures into a damp, penetrating chill. This kind of cold felt heavier and more exhausting than dry frost. Moist air pulled heat from the body quickly. Wool and fur helped, but once clothing became wet, it lost much of its protection. Wind slipped through small gaps, around the neck and sleeves, cutting straight to the skin. Exposure became dangerous very fast. Homes offered only limited shelter. Smoke-filled interiors trapped heat unevenly, while drafts crept in through walls and roofs. Even near the fire, people stayed cold. Hands stiffened, joints ached. Shivering drained energy needed for survival. For those who worked at sea, the damp cold was especially deadly. Wet skin and wind caused rapid hypothermia. Many accidents were fatal not because of storms, but because cold left no time to recover. This was not a cold that stayed outside. It entered clothes, homes, and lungs. Warmth was never taken for granted. It had to be maintained every day. Although forests existed, firewood was not endless. Timber was already heavily used for ships, houses, tools, and fences. Heating through long winters consumed massive amounts of fuel. Wood had to be cut, dried, and stored well before winter. Miss that preparation, and there was no solution later. Even when fuel was available, it burned quickly. Fires were kept small to conserve wood. Homes were never truly warm, only warm enough to survive. When wood ran short, people burned peat or animal dung. These burned poorly and filled homes with thick smoke. Interiors became dark and unhealthy. Smoke irritated eyes and lungs, contributing to long-term illness. Yet without fire, freezing was certain. Someone had to tend the hearth constantly, hauling fuel through snow and ice. Energy spent staying warm reduced energy for cooking, repairs, or caring for the sick. In warmer parts of Europe, heating was seasonal. In Scandinavia, it was a matter of existence. Winter also cut Scandinavia off from the outside world. Seas froze. Harbors locked in ice. Rivers turned into solid barriers. Ships that once carried grain, salt, and iron stayed trapped on shore. Overland travel was just as dangerous. Snow buried roads. Landmarks disappeared. Darkness made navigation difficult. Merchants avoided winter travel, knowing one storm could mean death. Trade slowed and then stopped. Communities relied entirely on what they had stored. There was no resupply, no emergency help. If stores ran low, there were no options. Money lost meaning when goods could not move. Markets fell silent. Families turned inward, sharing resources locally. Isolation strengthened community bonds but increased risk. If something failed, everyone felt it. In southern Europe, winter slowed trade. In Scandinavia, it erased it completely. Distance became danger. Survival depended on preparation long before the cold arrived. People did not survive by trying to defeat winter. They survived by accepting it as permanent. Life was organized around cold, not against it. Diets focused on dried fish, salted meat, fermented foods, and preserved dairy. Meals were designed for endurance, not pleasure. Homes were built low with thick walls and few openings. Windows were small or absent. Heat was conserved carefully. Families slept close together, sometimes with animals nearby, because warmth mattered more than comfort. Daily routines slowed. Energy was saved whenever possible. Clothing followed the same logic. Wool, fur, and leather were layered for insulation, not appearance. Repairs were constant. Nothing was wasted because replacing items in winter was nearly impossible. Emotionally, endurance became normal. Cold, hunger, and darkness were expected. Children grew up learning patience and restraint. Emotional control was part of survival. This mindset separated Scandinavia from warmer regions. Where others saw winter as a temporary problem, Scandinavians treated it as the base condition of life.